Okay, we're live. Jeremy Daggett. Thanks for joining me.
It's an honor. Thanks so much.
Yeah, man. My good friend and former teammate, Jeremy Daggett, here. He is coming to us from Peru and making me a little nostalgic as I think back on some of the most important years in my life so far and in my family's life. And boy, just a tremendous. I've talked about this on a solo episode before, but just there's a lot there for me internally. So I love that you're a part of that. That every time I connect with you, I'm sort of carried back into that. But tell everybody, like where you are exactly and what you're up to and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I ought to preface this by saying Greg is one of my heroes. And so to even
Ha.
get to be in this conversation and the solo episode you referenced, your penultimate one, I think it was, after you had
Hmm.
just been in Arequipa with us, was really meaningful to me because obviously, anyway, Greg and I are friends, but Greg, I've looked up to you for a long time. And so to hear you reflect back on what you saw sort of in us, and after all these
Yeah,
years, I've been thinking, how would Greg have done this? Or maybe things would have been better had Greg and Megan been here. And well, even you had
definitely
Anna
not.
you had Anna on the podcast a couple episodes ago as well. And she came and spent a few weeks with us here, and just your whole family, we love and respect so much. And, so anyway, to get to be here and chat is super fun, and it's an honor. And we have such deep love and respect and thankfulness for how sort of God wove some of our stories together, and then continues to. Because I got to be at your house just a couple weeks ago, so
Yeah,
thankful
yeah.
for.
The, listen, you said something, and it just makes me think like this is such an interesting dynamic. Since I haven't worked in other spaces, I don't know how this is, but I have an outsider's perspective on, most kinds of career paths that get portrayed in one way or another. And I don't know that there are a lot of spaces outside of like healthy Christian ministry where there would be such mutuality of admiration. You know what I mean? It's like, you're my hero. No, 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 no. You're my hero. Like seriously, the just looking at each other and going like, it's because we are ultimately admiring what God is doing in the other, right? And doing in unique ways, in ways that, I can't do what you do. I couldn't have done it that way. It would have gone different if someone else were there, including me, but it also needed to go the way that it did. And I don't know. It strikes me as so interesting and maybe like foreign. That's what I was wondering, is like, how strange is it? Does it seem like we're just sort of blowing smoke at each other when we say that? It was like, genuinely, I mean it. I left and I was like, man, he's so good at this. I feel really humbled. Like I'm so impressed. And yeah. So I don't know. I just don't feel I mean, obviously everybody's got insecurity, right? Um, but it's not like a competitive or self-comparing. It's just like, I'm grateful. I'm so grateful for the church, for the kingdom, for my neighbors in Arequipa, that you all said yes to ministry there. And so,
Yeah, yeah. Well, so Greg asked just like who I am and what I'm doing. My my wife and I moved to Arequipa about 10 years ago, and there's a whole story leading up to why Arequipa, and that's connected with Greg and your family and friends, Kyle and Larissa Smith, and um, but we moved here sort of as what you think of traditional missionaries sent by two churches in the United States so that we could live in Arequipa, Peru, and sort of dedicate our full time and work capacities to making our lives here in Arequipa, coming to fall in love with the city of a million people, and um, thinking about how to share sort of life and faith in terms of working with small house churches, in terms of sustainable community development with a small nonprofit, and and so that's what we did for our first few years. And then now a big part of our life and work here is getting to work with Harding University. The Latin America Study Abroad program is now based in Arequipa. Greg and Megan were the first in the first group. I can't remember. I feel like you spoke about this recently. Maybe not. Maybe I'm just thinking about us being together and speaking.
Maybe in passing, but it is a really cool full circle thing. So just say it again.
Yeah. So the first hula more than 20 years ago, hula stands for Harding University Latin America, and was based in Chile, and that's where Greg and Megan met. I'm not going to tell your whole love story, but fast
you know how mad Megan would be if you told it on the podcast before she told it on the podcast.
I would never do. But in 2019, we took over as directors for that. And so that meant that we really, the way we talk to our supporting churches about it, we asked for them to continue to support us. And we really feel like we're still full-time, 100% missionaries here in Arequipa. Mm-hmm. But we asked our churches to go on half support because Harding was going to be providing the other sort of half salary, and in order to be able to dedicate 3 months of our year. So really coming up soon in a few days. At the time of this recording, in a few days, our group of 35 students is going to come and spend 3 months with us. And so I'm in a position now where I get to sort of do as my job, my dream, which is live and work as a person sharing faith in a cross-cultural context here in Arequipa. And I also get to teach university students and walk alongside their sort of opening up to how big the world is, how interesting, how much we can learn about God through interacting with people who are different than we are culturally. And so for the last 6 years, we've been directing hula, and I've been getting to teach at the university level while living here in Arequipa. And so it's a really special sort of collision of vocation and opportunities that my wife and I, Katie and I, are deeply thankful for. We have 2 young kids who are 9 and 6 now, and so getting to watch them grow up with them with this as their normal is awesome. It's so fun, and so we're really thankful for what we get to do here.
Man, there are so many interesting things about what you're doing now to me. But one of the ones that just struck me is, when what we call Team Arequipa 1.0, right? The OG teammates were there full time. One of the things that we gave pretty significant attention to was having college interns every summer. and we did that out of a conviction. I don't know how much it was, really shared among all the teammates, but the internship opportunities I had as a college student were so important in terms of my formation and orientation. So vocation, right? Heading in a particular direction that I wouldn't have thought of or known about otherwise, that I just felt like this deep responsibility, and everybody was on board. We loved the opportunity to mentor students for a couple of months and it sort of introduce them into mild culture shock and discomfort and all of those sorts of things, and begin answering questions about, like, well, what do you think the gospel even is? What would it mean to say good news in this place? And how would you go about doing that? What are these people like? And how would you relate to them? And all of those sorts of, basics, really fundamental stuff. It's great. Loved it. And I felt some like, oh man, when the second wave, you guys came in and just felt like for various reasons you weren't going to be able to sustain that model, and for good reasons. I didn't disagree with the decision. I was just like, oh, I feel like that was really good for those students that were coming in. And then at this point, you're bringing in a much bigger group of students for much longer and with way more sophistication, mentoring and equipping them to navigate Latin America and think in missional terms, which is, I was like, okay, all right, I just needed to be, and there was a direction this was going. But that's one of the things I love about it, because to me, what you're doing is like now this may be insulting. I don't mean it this way. It just feels like a hulked out version of what we were aiming for, with a couple of 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes
Hmm.
8 weeks at the most, with college students. And you've got a whole semester, and you've got way more structure and curriculum, and you've got a theology informing this in a way that I didn't, that I want to talk about, and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, that just came to mind.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and a couple things there. For the record, we did continue the internships, and they were connected with ACU and with Harding, and then maybe Oklahoma Christian, which are all
Right.
connected with our tradition and Churches of Christ. And then we even had a couple of other students who came through, and we did that for 2 or 3 summers. And it was
Yeah.
really though when all of the rest of what we called Team Arequipa 2.0, the second wave of missionaries, we came with the team. But eventually that was transitioning to where those families were moving back to the States. And the family that
Yeah.
ended up staying the longest with us stayed here for 5 years. So they were actually part of our first hula semester in 2019. But when we accepted the job to do hula and to work with students every spring semester for Northern Hemisphere spring
Yeah.
semester, we just thought, man, we can't do those 3 months and then right on the heels of that another couple of months.
No. Yeah. Yeah.
But then in terms of, and I want to say this, it's not an insult whatsoever to hear you say, like, okay, I see sort of my internship and then you built out from that. But your internship was academic, which I think made it so special because you expected the interns not to just come in and do a bunch of mission work, which they did participate in a number of things and very practical and concrete things. But also you had readings for them. You had a
Hmm.
curriculum and readings and
Yep.
conversations and classroom time set up, which I think is probably the most responsible way to do that sort of thing. And so yeah, now we have, we have all of that, and it's with an accredited university, and so there's standards and all
Yeah.
these things that we uphold. And at the same time, I'm very clear that it's not a missions internship, right? This is
Right.
a semester of study abroad. But my whole goal with these students is to if they're not at this point yet, which if I share any more of my story, I can just be brutally honest that I wasn't as a 19, 20-year-old coming.
Yeah.
Um, I, I hope to create in them this desire, like this curiosity to learn, and
Mm.
that there's something to learn in this experience. And I was a terrible learner. I feel like I'm a better learner now because I just love there's very few things I'm not curious about and not wanting to
Yeah.
learn about. And so if they're not there yet, I try to create that curiosity, but that desire to learn is in fact, I think, the best starting point for any sort of mission, what we want to call mission, and participation in it is to do that as a learner, right? And so there's
Okay.
a lot of overlap with what missions internships look like here. And now what we've done, instead of having, like a 6 to 8 week summer internship, is we've taken missions apprentices that have come for a year and a half or 2 years, and in fact have been our two most recent apprentices have been former hula students. So
Yeah.
they did the 3 month thing and decided, okay, I want to spend a couple of years and actually get serious about learning Spanish and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So that's
Oh, that's
been
awesome.
it's
That
been
was that.
positive.
Yeah, that's one of those things that you did that I was really hoping to do, which was recruit apprentices out of interns. We ended up, our apprentices were sort of just a smattering of people that were randomly interested and connected. I mean, we weirdly had a very international cohort of apprentices, between a Finnish couple and an Australian couple, and then an American single woman. And looking back on that, I have really no idea how that came about. But we never could. Maybe my summer internship was just too academic. They didn't want to come back and do classes for 2 years or whatever. But we never could get one of our college apprentices to come join us. So
Well,
that's really cool to see, man. I mean, like, I love seeing that hook and interest grow.
Well, and I hope you also heard that that wasn't an insult that you had an academic internship. In fact, I think that made it really good. but
No,
but it
well,
was, I
they would
think,
have used it as an
first
insult.
step.
I mean, I wasn't unaware of the fact that they were like, "Wait a minute, we're reading stuff in the summer." I was like, "Yo, this is yeah." No, they were generally all good sports about it,
Yeah.
and and I think it is the right way. I mean, I think you've got to have that reflection piece. It wasn't like over the top. It wasn't intense, but it was like pre-trip reading
Mhm.
and just preparing to have conversations and have some language for things we'd be talking about and so on. So, yeah, no, that was really cool, and one of the things that I do miss it, and so one of the things I'm excited about, getting finally getting a job full time in the university. With adjuncting, it has felt like all I could do was teach classes. I didn't have either the space or the opportunity as from the university side to like be there in the midst of students and having them in my home and that kind of stuff. I mean, most of what I've done has been from some distance, and so I'm genuinely excited about, and so is Megan, having students in our home and like connecting outside of the classroom with those who are interested in bigger conversations about various things. And so, yeah, it's awesome to see it. So, Harding University, Latin America, and tell everybody like what's the shape of that basically? What are they doing?
Yeah, so we have a group of 20 to 30 students, 35 coming in just a few days, who are doing a semester of university classes. For most of them, and the way it works at Harding is that they've saved classes during their second year from the general sort of liberal arts curriculum that these required classes that they have to take for whatever major. So we get a smattering of majors and some who are interested in Spanish, others, usually the majority, who may have had a year or two of high school Spanish, but that's not, their interest or purpose necessarily for coming. They're doing a semester of university classes that are based with like a residential study abroad program here. So they all will live in this hotel that we rent out to be our campus for the semester. And so we take classes there, the students eat there, sleep there, and that's home for 3 months. And then during that time, we also travel. And so
Hmm.
there are on-site classes here in the city in terms of like museums and a walk that I do with them to sort of introduce them to how where I see God sort of at work in the long history of Arequipa, the city with so much, so much tension, starting, starting, but with 500 years of Catholic sort of
Hmm.
colonial influence. And here we are, right, as people of faith asking questions about what it means to live in the city. We then travel to other places in Peru, and so we take them to Cusco and the Sacred Valley, to Machu Picchu, which is sort of what people, when they hear Peru, are thinking about. We have most within the last couple of years, we actually have gotten Amazon.com to ship us things here, but we have the original Amazon. So we take the students to the rainforest, the Amazon
Yeah.
rainforest, and
Yep.
that's a
Yep.
special trip. The northern Atacama Desert on the Peruvian coast, and one of our favorite places all time, which is actually within the region of Arequipa, and it's called the Colca Valley, and spend some time there. And they do a homestay with a Quechua-speaking family, and so it's very much this. There's time in the classroom, and then there's learning outside of the classroom. And our biggest trips are a 10-day trip to Buenos Aires, Argentina, and then to the Argentine Patagonia, and then a little hop to a small island in the middle of the Pacific called Rapa Nui, or Easter Island. And so all of this is part of their sort of semester abroad, and it's all part of the learning experience, the big humanities class that they do. And then I teach a Bible course I view it as sort of the theological counterpart to the humanities course, where we
Hmm.
reflect theologically on everything that we're seeing and doing. And so that's broad strokes of what it looks like for these students. And some are really coming for like the cross-cultural experience, and we try to give them,
Yeah.
with the 3 months based in Arequipa, as much opportunity to make relationships and to become regulars at a specific coffee shop, or to be able to befriend some Peruvians here in the city. But then some come just for the trips. They hear, oh, Patagonia, okay, right?
Right.
But there's
Right.
an opportunity there because they've come to study and really make some special connections there. I concur with you about loving to teach in person, right? Versus, like, I know
Hmm.
online there's so much good that happens online, but getting to teach in person is just so fun. So many more opportunities there. And I get to teach in person and also travel with these students and spend just 3 months, and we're in community, right? And so that
Yeah.
it's exhausting, but it's also
Yeah.
so fun in terms of the opportunities for learning together. And a lot of students, it's they've maybe been on a mission trip somewhere or a family vacation out of the U.S. For some, it's their first time out of the U.S., and so there's a lot of special opportunities that come when you're crossing cultures and
Yeah.
in this sort of international way.
Yeah. So your wife and children go with you on all of these trips and are involved in everything. Um, what's the experience of raising kids with this situation? Like,
Yeah,
I'm
well,
just
I'd say
curious.
yes and no. They don't do all the trips at this point. So
Yeah.
the way the Peruvian school year works is that we start in March and go through December. So we're on, we're in January right now, and this is our summer break. And so Hula starts at the beginning of February. And so for all of February, the whole family is doing all of it. So that's why we put the
Yeah.
big Argentina trip in that space, and we do all it together. And the kids love it. They love having. It's really amazing, these college students, and the way they just treat Adeline and Kenny like younger, brother and sister, and
Yeah.
just it's really special for them. So our kids love it. And then come March, our kids start school. And so there will be some trips at that point where Katie and the kids will stay back. So just to give them that consistency. All right, it's the beginning of the school
Hmm.
year. We're not going
Yeah.
to skip too much class early on. Although we inevitably we'll just choose a trip or two on the second half of Hula every year for them to get to do. Or
Yeah.
Kenny loves, my 6-year-old loves the rainforest, and so like last year, Adeline and my wife Katie stayed back in Arequipa, but I went with Kenny to the rainforest, right? And so they rotate through, and my 6-year-old rates hotels based on their breakfast buffets, right? He's like, oh yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
this is a good one. Yeah, I remember that this is a good one. I want to go on that trip. So priority.
Yeah. That's one of the things that I have loved about my kids, particularly Anna being older. She was about the age you were when you moved from Italy back to the United States. We haven't told that part of your story yet, but um, so old enough to have, to a significant extent, been enculturated as a Peruvian, and and just how cosmopolitan she is. And all three of them, I guess that's just sort of a part of being in a family like ours that is dispositionally open to every new experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Taste it, try it, whatever. And um, so one of the things that we really were tickled by, which I don't know how to calculate what part of this is experiential and what part is dispositional with Anna, because she is so outgoing, but um it was like she could relate. She related to the college students that lived in our house like she was one of them, and she's like 7 years old, right? And just totally at ease with these college students. And that has translated into, on into her life of being just comfortable in situations with people that are older than her. She wasn't, as concerned about peers as she was interested in, like, well, what are you guys up to? What are we doing today? And they're like, hey, yeah, Yeah. Sure, Anna.
Yeah,
So I don't
absolutely.
know. Have you? Yeah. What are you seeing in your kids like as they absorb to some extent a very distinctive way of life?
Yeah, so yeah, it's special, and I'm so thankful the caliber of student that we get, how thoughtful they are, and there's little things we have to coach them on, like, hey, we'd rather if you want to hang out with our kids, which is not your job, and we're just thankful, right, when you
Mm-hmm.
spend
Mm-hmm.
time with them, but we'd rather you not be on your phones. They're learning how to read. They don't get a chance to read in English so often because everything they do in school is in Spanish. So
Mm-hmm.
read a
Mm-hmm.
book together. We have to do some of that. Um, that
Yeah.
coaching. Kenny's love for like fighting and stuff has come from some of the guys that have come
Yeah.
over the last few years. I'm like, well, okay, it's time to calm down a little bit. But in like, yeah, they are both. One, like, Adeline is a 9-year-old, and we've just the last couple of years been working with her on how to navigate an airport, right? And she can
Mm-hmm.
just, like, I think here in a year or two, she could just lead the group through airports
Yeah.
in, in Peru and in Argentina. And they are both very comfortable with college students and have just had, that's just been a part of their lives. We're trying to
Yeah.
be attentive to how close you get in the course of 3 months to a group of people that then you're just going to say goodbye to and likely not see again, or definitely not regularly anyways. And so
Yeah.
there's a
Yeah. We're
difficulty there, that we see and acknowledge and are just conscious of, right? And so they remember, students from the last year or two, but then, like, when your daughter Anna came and spent a few weeks with us this past summer, and then we were talking about that we had an Anna in our hula group, and then Anna McKenzie who came and like was with us, and we just have to like talk our kids through when we remember either pull up the picture or remind
yeah.
them, no, not hula Anna who came, anyway. So
Yeah.
it that is something that isn't that's it's out of the norm, right, to
No,
have that
oh,
many number of
absolutely.
relationships, right, that then you have to just say goodbye. And so that's a challenge, but there's so many sort of beautiful pieces to it, that we're
Yeah.
really thankful
Yeah.
really thankful for.
Man, what a huge challenge. We are dealing to some extent with ripple effects of that kind of relational to and fro and dislocation and all those sorts of things in our household. Um, I love that you said that Adeline could guide them through the airport. Maggie, for the listeners, that's my second daughter. Is she says, and I believe her favorite place on the planet is an international airport.
Okay.
She feels so at home, which I love because when you think about it, like it's easy to forget what it's like to fly for the first time, or much less to fly internationally for the first time. And if you're at an airport of any size, it's like overwhelming. Like there's so much going on, and it seems like there's rules and there's people with guns, and everybody's very sort of like regimented, and things are supposed to happen a particular way, and there's like time sensitive things happening and announcements going off constantly, and like and it's like sensory overload for so many people. And for Maggie, feels like it's her native environment. Like she's
Wow.
like, I love it. Every time we go to an airport, she's like, oh, this is the best. Like that is an MK kind of a thing, right? That's a different take on that experience. So I really appreciate so there are these challenges that come with raising our kids
Yeah.
as third culture kids, and then on top of that, third culture kids who have very distinctive experiences, such as 20 somethings living in their house or being in close proximity for months at a time, and so on and so forth, having cross cultural relationships that are, I think there is a distinctiveness to so third culture kid refers to any kid who's raised in a cultural environment different than their parents' native environment. And so this applies to not only missionaries, but also to military brats and foreign business kids, kids that end up in Bombay or Shanghai or whatever for their parents' business purposes. Those are the three main categories. But there's something really distinctive about MKs who form profound relationships with church people who are natives in that other culture and have now the complexity of deep cross-cultural relationships that I think probably most military brats and most business kids, that they're not going to be. I need to make a theological claim here. How could they? How could they be in a family relationship with with people who are not in some way connected to them spiritually? And so that's so. There's like a lot of complications, right? But at the same time, just blessings. And I would love for you to like. I've heard you almost like I've eavesdropped on you talking about this some, but your own experience as an MK and how that shaped you and what that had to do with your own vocation, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. So, uh, our kids, because my wife and I are both from the U.S. and our kids were born here in Peru, so they are Peruvian, but they look like
Mm-hmm.
U.S. Americans. They look like us, and so often they will be, called out here and just ask like, well, oh, where are you from? And my daughter's at the point now as a 9-year-old where she's just offended. She's like, I'm Peruvian. It's like, it's this identity. She is Peruvian, and she is. She was born here, but
Oh yeah.
she has to. I just love that sort of pride for where she's from. And
Oh
I was
yeah.
the same way. I was born and grew up in Italy. And so my dad, especially compared to like a generation of like my grandparents. So my mom was born in Italy because my grandparents were missionaries in Italy. And so there's a couple generations here where this has
The
been
family business. Yeah, yeah,
a point of focus. My grandfather actually started the international programs at Harding about 40 years ago. So that's another wrinkle. But um, so we were, my dad worked so hard to speak Italian well, and he did for U.S. Americans spoke Italian really well and great accent, but Italians could still always tell he wasn't Italian. And then my brother and I, just growing up early years in Italy and speaking Italian just perfectly, just like any of our peers, and sort of the injustice of how hard my dad had to work for that versus us just it coming naturally, right? But that
yeah.
was a big formative piece for me. And I only lived in Italy till I was 8, and then we moved to the U.S. And I was very clear with anyone who asked us about how is it being back. I was very clear with them that I was not back in the United
I'm not
States. This
back.
is my first
Yeah.
time to live in the United States, right? And so there's a chip on my shoulder with that. But then we started taking Harding groups to Italy on, they were called like summer campaigns. But the idea was that we would visit and try to encourage and work with some churches all over Italy for about 6 weeks. And that is what allowed my older brother and I to maintain speaking our Italian, right? So
Mm.
there weren't any chances to practice it in Searcy, Arkansas, where we had moved to. And so we were able to maintain that. And that's just was such a sort of like Maggie, you were saying Maggie feels so at home in airports. I
Yeah.
realized as I ended up studying at Harding University, and I realized even though I was undeclared at the beginning of my freshman year, I realized that I felt most at home in sort of cross-cultural, environments where I'm out of sort of my home area, whether
Hmm.
it's traveling to another country, being in a different sort of space, very much with sort of traditional like mission trips. That I had done that in Italy, and I had done that
Yeah.
in the Northeast. We lived in the Boston area for a few years, and such important sort of formative years for me up there, being out of sort of the Bible Belt South and still
Sure.
working on my faith, and so many things that were formative for me in that space. But I realized that that's where I felt most myself, sort of like Maggie at the
Hmm.
airport, right? And so that became a big part of then me choosing to study missions at Harding. I didn't go in with that, and somehow my parents, as missionaries, were able to raise me in a way that made me feel no pressure that should be my vocation, and I applaud them for that. And at the same time, realizing that, oh well, maybe this is my vocation, right? And so
Hmm.
that was my first year where I started to come into that, come into
Mhm.
that understanding of a sense of calling and vocation and identity that really comes through this formative process that was, years and years in the making.
I wonder about that formative. When I listen to stories like that, I wonder how the average U.S. American. Okay, let's do a parentheses real quick. Hold on 1 second, everybody. Jeremy and I have this long, ongoing conversation about the phrase U.S. American, which I've just used to oblige him. But
It means so
he,
much.
it does. No, say why, because I think people are probably hearing, if they're listening to this episode, the handful of you out there, thank you for listening. Um, you're hearing the phrase U.S. American, and maybe for the first time, and maybe thinking, why is he saying it like that? You mean American?
Yeah, well, let me be clear that American referring to somebody from the United States of America is correct. Okay,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
the way to say it.
yeah.
That's dictionary correct.
Mm-hmm.
However, other languages like Italian and like Spanish have a specific word for someone from the US. In Spanish, it's
Mm-hmm.
estadounidense, which is
Mm-hmm.
someone from Estados Unidos. All right. And
United
so
States.
I realized sometimes I would hear, well, and so here in Peru, most people know if you say American, they know you're talking about somebody from the US. However,
Yep.
we have a mutual friend who is, if you say American, she'll say, "Oh, yeah, I'm American too." And she's Peruvian. And it's because she is South American. In Peru, kids are taught that America is one continent with North, Central, and South being regions within one continent. Okay, so it's not even
Mm-hmm.
North
Mm-hmm.
America isn't specific enough either because North America encapsulates an entire continent, right? As we think about it from a US perspective. And
Yeah, yeah.
so, and that includes Mexico and really
Mm-hmm.
Central America is part of North America, the continent, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I say
Mm-hmm.
US American because I realized to me it was important to just that the specificity was important to
Yeah,
recognize that America is a big place and bigger than
yeah,
just U.S. America.
yeah.
And when I'm speaking about someone from there, it's once you get into the flow, it's easy to do. And so Greg was laughing about this because in the journal, Missy O'Day, when I would help with editing, I would just suggest every time I saw American, I would
Mm-hmm.
suggest U.S. American
Mm-hmm.
is the proper way to write
Yeah.
that. And so it's just become I'm not judging anyone when they say American. I have to tell my students this because they hear me, and that's actually part of what I'm teaching them is just to be aware of how our language frames our view of the world. And
Mm.
so to me, saying US American is just one sort of hat tip to, okay, this is a couple of continents, depending on how you count it, with a lot of people. And yes, God bless America. And I think all of it.
Yep, yep. Yes. And that's the point that's so important about what you're doing. Like I love it because I think words are vitally important, and I think playing with words and messing with the way that people say things messes with the way people think things. And it's the right move, especially to highlight the ethnocentrism, right? The, we're having all kinds of interesting conversations these days about implicit bias and so on, which, in the context of American racism, and say what you will about where we are in that long trajectory of intergroup relationships. The strange thing to me has been, as a missiologist, hearing people talk about these concepts like they're new, like this is a new idea that we have these under the surface hidden biases, and really we need to interrogate our own assumptions about things. And like earlier in my life, this is some years ago when this really started to kind of be a more mainstream conversation in the U.S. American context. I thought, yeah, this is This is missions, principles, and practices. This is missiology 101. This is, you see things from a cultural frame that you need to break. And ethnocentrism is that ethnic self-centeredness that we all carry into these experiences that your students are having, and you're trying to
Mhm.
break that for them, break the frame for them somewhat, and see like, oh look, you've assumed all along that America means you, and actually there's another way to look at the, and what is that language portraying when I'm American, God bless America, so on and so forth. It's like, okay, so you got a kind of a small view of the world. You think you're pretty hot stuff, but you don't really understand where you are or who you're talking to and how it affects them as a U.S. American, known not for our humility per se, and so I love it. I love that challenge that you issue. I just didn't want to have to footnote in every article we published, even though I think it should be a missiological convention. It's like, I agree with you, but I don't think we're going to win that battle. And then it just adds this extra work of constantly commentating, like, by the way, so
Yeah, yeah.
it was it was it fell to the executive editor to make that decision, and I don't know that it was the right one, but it was the one we made back in the day. So anyway,
Well, at least we can, be here on the Theology on the Way podcast with a 10-minute parenthetical about U.S. America. That's good enough for me. All these years
and
down
that
the road.
good that feels entirely natural to me. A 10-minute parenthetical. What were we talking about? No, what I was going to say. What I was going to say is, I wonder how the typical U.S. American, somebody who does not have very much cross-cultural experience, and on average, I know that that's true, doesn't even have very much intercultural experience in a local context, because on average, you you get to the center of that bell curve, and you're not talking about people who have a tremendous amount of sort of New York, L.A., Chicago kinds of experiences, but the other tail, the rural life, the
Hmm.
homogenous community is making that center, that average, basically unfamiliar with cross cultural interactions, and they may have had some, but did that as somebody with no clue about the dynamics of what's happening there, much less being an MK or something like that and being fully bicultural. I wonder how they hear your story, and how that shapes the way they think about calling for them. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? It's like, it's so many bridges further to enter into that world, and I'm always curious about it. I'm not asking, tell me what you think the answer to that is. I don't know, but it's just a thought that I had. It's like, I wonder what that sounds like to experience, that kind of childhood, and like we were just talking about with our kids, this huge world. Their world. That's the way Megan always says this. Our kids have such a big worldview, and and I, to some extent, I think that must be just almost impossible to imagine if you didn't grow up in it.
Well, so I'd like to say something about my own ethnocentrism as a fully
Cool.
bilingual, bicultural kid. But then I sort of want to ask you, how did you end up with this sort of sense of vocation to dedicate so much of your life in your formative years to preparing to move to Peru? Because
Yeah.
I don't, I haven't talked about your young life so much, but I don't think you grew up in another country speaking another language, right?
No. No.
And so you might have some, just in terms of how we ended up having a similar sense of vocation and working in the same city. And I wish we had gotten more than a few months of getting to work together here. But so that might be an interesting way to sort of circle back around to that. Part of
Yeah.
my story is that I grew up speaking English and Italian, and I grew up very comfortable in both Italian culture and U.S. American culture. There was some stuff in the U.S. where I was behind. For instance, we're growing up in Italy, and we'd spend some time in the U.S. And I just asked this guy who was playing basketball. I said, "Hey, can I play basket with you too?" because in Italy, basketball, we call basket. And there are just little things like that where he was like, "You mean basketball?" It was like this thing, like, "What are you talking about?" And so there's a
Or
learning curve.
when you said football, you meant football.
Right, right. That's can be. Or like just recently, our daughter, there was like baseball on the TV, and I don't remember what sport. She was like, "Oh yeah, that's that's volleyball, right?" I mean, she was just totally unaware of what sports we were talking about. So eventually, all right, eventually I got to a place where I was very comfortable both in a U.S. cultural context and Italian cultural context. But I realized as I got into my teen years, and this is looking back, right? I realized that I was the most ethnocentric, bicultural, bilingual kid in the world
Yeah.
because I had a US passport and was very aware of the power that gave me, and
Yeah.
just thankful, right, for having that passport that let me live in the US and travel where I wanted to travel. But speaking of travel, I didn't want to go anywhere but Italy. I had no
Yeah.
interest in learning a different language, no interest in Spanish, no interest in traveling to other parts of the world. It's like I was there. I had made it, Italy and the US, and that's all you need. And it wasn't until we traveled to Italy with 5 Spanish speakers that were part of our group. And 2 of them were from Mexico, one from Guatemala, um, and then a couple of others who were from the US, but because of different reasons had already gotten very good at Spanish. And seeing them through their Spanish learn Italian pretty well for just the few
Hmm.
weeks that they were there. And then, of course, I was 16 years old, and so I was hanging out with these college students. And of course, that then sort of pushed me to like, oh yeah, let me learn a few Spanish words here and there, see if I can make them laugh. And that experience opened up my world, and it made
Yeah.
me for the first time interested in something besides my own sort of 2 cultures and 2 languages that I already had. And it was
Yeah.
really that was like this important piece in what got me to where I am now, because that was between junior and senior year of high school. So my whole senior year of high school, I didn't take a Spanish course, but I worshiped with a Spanish speaking community in Searcy, Arkansas. And
Hmm.
that's how I learned Spanish. So then
Yeah.
as I started off with an undeclared sort of main major at Harding, I was a Spanish major from day one because I knew I was like, oh,
Yeah.
this is so fun. I want to learn Spanish. And then I realized when for, missions and theology, studying Greek and then Hebrew, and I thought, oh, this is fun too. It's not just because Italian and Spanish are so similar.
Hmm.
And so then my senior year, I took a year of French just because it was fun, right? And
Hmm.
so it was really this moment in my young and sort of, I guess, later teen life where I realized, oh, the world is big and this is incredible, right? But
Yeah.
I guess all that to say that it doesn't just happen. And I think you'd probably agree that a lot of the experience of ethnocentrism that is so just it's just part of the human experience. That's
It
just
is.
normal. It's just
It's innate.
normal,
Yeah.
and it's part of growing up and whatever. That's how culture works. Of
It
course, you
is.
think your own culture is the right way or the normal way or the way things work. And so ethnocentrism isn't necessarily a negative thing. Now, when it
Mm.
manifests as racism, as discrimination, it can be very destructive. But just
Yeah.
normal, everyday ethnocentrism is just part of what it means to be human in this
Hmm.
diverse world. And I came around to it, I feel like pretty late, given the hand I was dealt. With
Yeah.
growing up with a couple of languages. And so that's why with my kids, I've tried to just be more intentional. I'm not forcing them to learn other languages, but they're aware that if they want to learn Italian sometime with me, they can. Or we dabble in some Quechua because of it being one of the original languages of this area. And so just knowing some basic Quechua can be special. And so I've been more intentional with my kids about that, realizing that it doesn't just happen.
That's right. That's right.
But so, so
Yeah.
anyway, that came to my vocation. I'm curious for you,
Hmm.
how it is that, growing up, and I know you're from Tyler, Texas. I don't know if your whole childhood was there, but how is it that young Gregory McKenzie ends up looking out South America and living
Yeah.
here for so many years.
Yeah. So my childhood experience, in a way, also prepared me for, uh, let's call it foreign mission work. Um, in the sense that dislocation was normal for me.
Okay.
I call Tyler home. I did eighth grade through high school
Okay.
in White House, a suburb of Tyler. That was the longest I lived anywhere, 5 years. And so we moved a lot for work reasons, moving two jobs, and I lived in various places in Texas, lived in Oklahoma, lived in Washington State, lived in Alaska. Um, uh, in Alaska after my parents separated, and my brother was living in Alaska, and so my mom, sister, and I went and lived with his family. He's 20 years older than me, and so they were already established and were able to kind of help my mom get on her feet. And so so I already had the experience of being uprooted, and not
Mm.
I didn't identify with a particular place, and I had I've had to, as an adult, I've had to work through some of the negative consequences of that in terms of relationships, being in a place long term, having roots, having, a lot of grief from relationships that were abruptly ended as we moved on to other places and things like that. So there's the dark side of that, but the other side was, as I was finishing high school and beginning to think about mission work as what I wanted to do for reasons that I'll explain. It was not hard for me to think about, okay, I'll move to a new place, and I'm not leaving family in the sense that,
Mm.
like, my wife was leaving family, where it was
Yeah.
she
Yeah.
had lived in one place for always, where her parents had lived for always, where her grandparents had lived for always, and it's like, I'm not just leaving my family, I'm leaving my place in
Yeah.
order to go into a totally foreign environment. And for me, I was like, it's fine, and and so that was a huge part of, like, my, again, that dispositional thing, that your
Hmm.
experiences shape you to kind of be a certain way, uh, in terms of change basically. But that doesn't really speak to the ethnocentrism of my profoundly Texan family, despite all the moving that my immediate family did. It's like, I come from a southeast Texas people who are, quintessentially that. I'll just leave it at that, right? And
Yeah.
so, uh, what changed that for me, and part of the reason that I was so committed to those internships, was that one thing that my youth group did in high school was every summer do a trip to Mexico. And I have my thoughts now about what we were doing and all of the implications of those things in terms of a more mature missiology. But I have to be absolutely transparent about the fact that that experience changed my life and set me on a
Hmm.
path. As a high schooler, our school was set up where you could do 4 years of Spanish if you wanted. You had to do two, right, to graduate, of a foreign language, and that was the one that was. I think there was French offered as well, but almost everybody did Spanish. And so, as a freshman in high school, I'm doing Spanish one. It's the only C I ever got in high school. I hated it. It felt like an absolute imposition. It felt pointless. I resented it profoundly, and didn't try. I was like, I don't, which was not me. I mean, I tried, academically. I felt bad about not getting good grades, and felt bad if I got a B, and so a C was really out of the norm. But I was just like, I don't care. This is ridiculous. And then that first summer after my freshman year was my first trip to Mexico, and interacting with the Mexican church there and being unable to communicate and realizing that I had squandered this opportunity to know something, to be able to communicate a little bit. And again, to be totally transparent, there was a really cute Mexicana that I was crushing on, and I wanted to be able to talk to her. And so I came back from that trip just committed in my you know all in way, that that's a part of my personality, is when I decide that I'm going to do something, I'm doing it all the way to the hilt. And so from that, so then I was like, all right, I'm doing Spanish 1 through 4. I became president of the Spanish club. I was all about it, right? I was like, I will be able to communicate every time we go to Mexico. And so that kind of set me on a path with Spanish.
Hmm.
But up until my junior year of high school, I was planning to do archaeology. That was what I was really passionate about, and I had a, the degree of interest that one needs to go into a field like that. Um, but my faith was growing in a way that just made it just, I finally got to the point where I was like, no, I have I have to say yes to mission work in a foreign place. One really powerful influence in that for me was that it just so happened that my home church in Tyler was preparing to send a missionary couple to Uganda.
Okay.
And so they stayed with the church for a number of months in preparation for that move. And so that was like a main thing happening in our church life, and they were speaking a lot and talking about why they were going and what they were going to do and what this meant, and that just fired my imagination. And that was right at that time when I was struggling with, am I going to go into ministry? And hearing them talk, I was like, oh, I know exactly what this is going to be, right? And also at that time deciding which college to go to, and I landed on Harding, which was where they were coming from. And I knew that Harding's missions program was really Africa centric. And so my whole imagination as a high schooler was tribal Africa, huts, and all of that kind of stuff. Oh, I'm going to be a foreign missionary, so I'm going to Africa. That's what I'm going to do. Wasn't thinking at all about the 4 years of Spanish that I was doing or anything like that. And so I got to Harding and fully expected to be trying to build a team to go to Africa. And instead what happened was I was randomly assigned in the pre-session week of my freshman year, an academic advisor in the Bible department, assigned randomly by alphabetical order, whatever the first letter of your last name is. Some random professor is going to get, LMNO or something. And so Mackenzie got assigned to Bill Richardson, who was the Latin American missions professor at Harding. And so we sit down for the first time. He's looking at my high school transcript, looking at the classes that I'm considering, and he goes, oh, you're already doing advanced Spanish, right? Because I had, since I had done Spanish 1 through 4, Harding had a deal where you were allowed to get credit for Spanish 101 and 102 automatically and go directly into 201, right? So I was already 2 credits toward a Spanish minor coming in as a freshman, needed 6 more classes. I was like, yeah, I'll do that. No problem. I'll get a minor in Spanish just because I can. And meet my foreign language requirements and have something more, And he goes, oh, you're already doing advanced Spanish. Why? What else are you doing with? Are you going to go to Latin America? And I was like, no, I think I'm probably going to Africa. And he's like, I don't know about that, bud. And he goes, well, if you really want to learn Spanish, if you're serious about this, then you need to do a few things. One, you need to attend Spanish church. And that's what I ended up doing. That was my church for all 4 years of college. If I was anywhere else in English, it was sort of secondary. And so every Sunday morning, I'm sitting in Spanish church, lost, trying to figure out, well, for one, realizing that 4 years of high school Spanish isn't much.
At its
And
limits, yeah.
yeah, yeah. But then so thrown into these relationships, and it turned out that my primary friendships at Harding were the Latin American students who did me the service, the kindness of hanging out with me and only speaking Spanish. They wouldn't speak English to me. And so that accelerated my Spanish. Second, Bill said, you really need to look at some summer mission trips in Latin America. I would encourage you to make use of your Spanish and do that. So I immediately did a spring break campaign in Mexico and then a summer trip to Venezuela. And from that point on, that was my trajectory for summer missions. And third, he said, nobody knows this yet, but I'm on the committee that is developing a brand new study abroad program here at Harding. It's called Harding University in Latin America, and it's going to be announced later this semester. And when it is, it's going to fill up really quickly. And so you need to be first on that list so that you can live for a semester in Chile. And he said, I'll be on that trip as one of the professors, and that would be a way to ensure that you learn Spanish really well. So he knew what he was doing, and did that trip, and of course met my wife on that trip, my wife to be, and the rest is history. At some point along the way, I was going to the Latin American missions interest groups that Bill was hosting in his home, and I just realized, oh, I'm not going to Africa. We're headed to Latin America somewhere, Spanish-speaking Latin America, and things progressed from there with team formation and all the rest. And so, for me, it was a combination of so many different factors, right? So many different things that, in retrospect, I would say, God is using these things to lead me into ultimately the city of Arequipa, and I'm so grateful for all of that. But it's a weird cocktail of disposition and life experience, and then like aggravation at myself and wanting to communicate, and then God, these divine appointments where I end up in Bill's office, and he knows exactly how to do his job and helps lead me in the direction I should go. And so that's it, man. That's the gist of that story.
Man, that's amazing. It's cool to hear, and even with our youth being so different, just different things that are similar, right? And it
Yeah.
was, I heard you say you hadn't lived anywhere for more than 5 years, and up until just most recently, I had never lived anywhere in any neighborhood for more than 5 years, and
Yep.
that was from 0 to 5, and then it had always been shorter. And then I lived 9 years in the same neighborhood in Arequipa, and a year ago we moved to where we are now, and very thankful for that. But those 9 years, I was like, wow, this is the longest I've lived anywhere. So my stable years have been in Peru, right?
Yeah.
But then the other piece, and for you it was in ninth grade or whatever, but that desire to communicate in Mexico, whether it was with the church or whether it was the girl you had a crush on or whatever, there's something fascinating and I believe sacred about the space within that linguistic diversity, where, and for me it was later on, it was after, in between my junior and senior year, where I was in Italy and could communicate really well, but then I was hearing Spanish and it just piqued my interest, right? And there's
Yeah.
something sacred there because it, language is this like key part of what makes us human. And at the same time, look at the linguistic diversity in our world, and there's a beauty and a depth there. And it's not to well, I challenge my students to think about language learning when they come here and they take Spanish class and then they practice it with people. language learning is a spiritual practice, because what happens
Yeah.
when the Spirit shows up, like in the book of Acts in chapter 2, the Spirit shows up speaking different languages, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the, and so it very much is a spiritual practice, because I believe somehow baked into the diversity, and not just human diversity, but especially in the human linguistic diversity, is something profoundly true about who God is and how God works in the world. And it's not to say that when you learn another language, you're this, superhuman. But it is to say that when you learn another language, you're tapping into something that I believe the Spirit of God is doing. And anyways,
Yeah.
I loved hearing that piece of, that there's this just desire to be able to communicate. And then when that
Mhm.
means speaking another language, there's a whole formation that happens through that. And that's significant.
It's so powerful, and it's hard to explain in a way that you can understand without experiencing it. But
Yeah.
by what I mean by that, by the antecedent of that sentence, is not just learning another language, but becoming fluent, becoming bilingual or trilingual or whatever. Um, it allows something to happen that's very difficult to get otherwise. So I have studied and taught a lot about worldview, and from philosophical perspectives, from anthropological perspectives, we have a whole bunch of frameworks and explanations for what that is and how that works, and how your worldview might be transformed, and how you might understand others, where the profound otherness of that encounter is what's at stake. And a grasp of worldview theory and a sense of what all that's about facilitates crossing that bridge and deepening that relationship with someone who is different than you in ways that are not trivial. And I think culture adds a layer of difference that it's not to say the difference between different Americans, U.S. Americans from different contexts and different life experiences, and so on, isn't also profound and requires real work, but that cultural difference, when you're talking about totally culturally different blocks of people, is something else entirely. It's a kind of otherness that has in human history almost always led to war. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's no small thing, and there is such a huge limit on comprehending that otherness if you haven't become bilingual. Because what happens when you become bilingual is you start having these experiences where you're thinking about the world through that linguistic framework and thinking thoughts that you could have never otherwise had. Right. And this happened for me only in the last couple of years of my 6.5 years in Peru, where I was finally fluent enough that I would be going through my day in Arequipa and processing an experience, and then I would all of a sudden go like, whoa, I'm processing that in Spanish the way a Peruvian thinks about things, and it is so utterly foreign to the way like the other half of myself thinks about that. I couldn't have felt it the same way. I couldn't have known it the same way. It is fundamentally different. And it is such a strange experience. It's very difficult to just communicate to somebody that hasn't had that experience, but language, in other words, is a pathway, if not the primary pathway, into that difference beyond merely understanding it theoretically, beyond using those sort of frameworks and academic explanations for what worldview is and how it works. It's so powerful for beginning to bridge the difference. I don't know what you grew up fully bilingual, and so maybe it's just so there with you that you haven't thought about it in the same way, or I don't know what would you say about that?
Yeah, yeah. I loved hearing all of that because I hadn't exactly thought of it quite that way, like being able to think thoughts that I otherwise couldn't have been able to think. There's something that came to me really naturally about learning Spanish sort of through the Italian pathway that
Hmm.
made it just sort of more natural to me. And I didn't take any high school Spanish, but I got to jump in like you were talking about at Harding. I just started with intermediate Spanish and I got credit for all of the first year because of I didn't
Yeah.
know the alphabet, but I could speak pretty well.
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
and so it came more naturally. But what I have realized in these 10 years that I've been here is that we languages can also give us this gift of personality. And my
Mm.
personality when I'm speaking in Spanish is different than my personality when I'm speaking
Yes.
in English, right?
Yes.
And I don't think it's necessarily the split personality thing, but my friend Jonathan Hannigan, who's been living in Latin America for more than 15, 16 years, and he's in Argentina now. And um, he says when we speak another language, we become more fully who we are. We're
Wow.
accessing parts of who we are in this emotive side with personality than we realize, right? And so
Yeah.
um, my Katie, my wife, just laughs because when I speak on the and I get excited as I speak and I'm passionate about things, but when I speak on the phone in English, which let's just face it, there's not. I feel like phone calls are sort of a thing of the past, right?
Yeah.
But when I do speak on the phone in English, it's pretty subdued, pretty calm and chill. And when I speak on the phone in Spanish, she can hear me from 2 blocks down the road.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
phone calls are still a big thing in Peruvian culture, or these voice audio messages that we, leave each other. And but I'm just animated in a different way. And
Yeah.
I promise. And I think people who are closest to me realize this. I'm not faking it.
It's
I'm
genuine.
not
Nope.
right, but it's part of who I am as I speak
That's
Spanish.
right.
And
That's right.
it is one of these things that you don't really think about, but is when you then reflect on it and you see what's happening, and wow, this is really interesting.
Yes, and I'm really glad you said that because that's an experience that I've had and I've talked about it a few times in different contexts, but didn't really know how others have experienced that and how unique it was for me because, I'm highly introverted and so it's kind of shocking that in Spanish, like when I switch into that mode, it's not just switching into ministry mode, which requires everyone who's an introvert to exercise a more extroverted part of yourself and use those muscles. But I, it's not, it's not the same experience as where I almost feel like I am performing extroversion in English.
Right.
I don't feel like I'm performing it in Spanish. I'm just being Peruvian Greg, and that feels like a compliment I shouldn't give myself. I'm not Peruvian. I'm an American doing my best in a Peruvian context, but it just something else comes out, and it's a different side of myself. And so, man, I love Jonathan's insight. There is pretty profound and interesting to me. More fully who I am. I suppose there is a more extroverted me in there somewhere.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and he's a Latin American. Yeah, that's really cool. Well, you've got a well-developed theology of travel. Is what you call it, a theology of travel. And I feel like we've started moving toward it a little bit in the conversation about otherness, ethnocentrism,
Yeah.
curiosity, and those sorts of things. So where does that lead you from that beginning point of curiosity and openness? Um, what I guess the first thing I want to ask is what does that theology of travel have to do with otherness? The profound differences between us that we encounter as we travel.
So you say a well-developed theology of travel. I'd say it's a project I'm working on and continue to work on, but it's
I'll
just
put it
where
this
my
way: it's the most developed theology of travel that I've seen. So there's
thanks.
that.
Thanks. But it is where sort of my just curiosity and imagination, and really for the last, it's been 12 years now. And funnily enough, where you were maybe in some universe heading to Africa, it was when I got to direct the Harding in Zambia program that all of this, the clash of such otherness, brought me around to this sort of starting point that I now have with who God is and what it means to be human, and
Yeah.
that's when I got started thinking about this. So the very baseline that I just that in 2012, when I got to travel with a group of students to Zambia, and we actually went to Uganda and Tanzania as well. And so when I was over there, I realized, and I had just sort of activated as a learner, like I had just realized, oh, like there's something profound to learn here. And it was a great timing because I was in Zambia and realizing that as I interacted with this expression, the Zambian expression of the image of God in humanity, there was something profound to be learned about God, um, Zambians, and just humanity in general, and the world. All right, and
Hmm.
so where I've thought about this as I've reflected more is one of my favorite places in all of Scripture to just sort of spend time is Genesis 1. And that was opened up to me by a professor in it was in my, I guess my junior year at Harding, and it was one of those classes where we're supposed to address all the critical issues in the Old Testament, and we spent a month and a half in Genesis 1 to 3. But it was like, for me, it was this eye-opening moment to finally focus less on, all right, what happened day one, day two, day three, day four of creation, and what does it say about God that this poem, or that this text would speak about God in these ways, almost as if the point of Genesis 1 isn't 7 24-hour days, but is saying something
Almost, right?
profound, something profound about who the God is that is this creator, right?
Yeah.
And when you read Genesis 1, there's just these profound and just really obvious um, allusions to, and then sometimes very directly mentioning diversity. And it's not just
Hmm.
human diversity, but it starts, God creates days 1 2 and 3, these spaces for life to happen and flourish. And then days 4 5 and 6 fills those spaces, right? So, with day one, light and dark, and then day four, the lights that will govern the day, and the moon and stars that will govern the night. In day two, you have this creation of air and water, right? Divisions in these spaces. So there's this intentional separation. One of the first verbs for God is God separates, right? So there's something
Hmm.
happening with pulling apart, delineating. And so if day two you have air and water, day five you have the first blessing in the scripture, and God blesses fish and birds to fill their spaces with marvelous diversity, right?
Hmm.
Day three, then you have the land, and in day six, that is filled in all sorts of diversity as well in the animal kingdom, but also sort of the plant diversity, and
According to their kinds,
all of
kinds and
the
kinds and kinds.
but
Yeah.
then it's, yeah, and then you have obviously humanity, right, that is created in God's image and likeness. But then the tale, sort of that account sort of finishes with everything being completed in their vast array, is one of the ways that the NIV puts it. And this vast array of creation, I'd like to argue, is part of what God loves. Like God,
Mm.
and so like we go to the Amazon rainforest, and just the incredible diversity of plant life and bird life. Anyone who just geeks out on insects will tell you, or
Mm.
bacteria or whatever, that there's just absurd, gratuitously absurd diversity baked into the whole thing. And
Yeah.
then you have humanity that is created, and then the command that's tied to this blessing is said, "Go and fill that space, fill the earth." And I read into that this desire of God to create diverse humanity by saying fill this diverse space. Like the natural thing that will happen as humanity spreads out and fills this diverse world is that it'll manifest in different ways. And that's why
Hmm.
I jumped to Genesis 11. It's this, if we want to talk about language, it's this ancient tale of the creation of many languages. And it's often painted, at least in sort of the circles that I grew up in, as a negative, is like, okay, humanity wanted to do this bad thing of creating this tower and making a name for themselves. And there's definitely this negative sense. I've seen some other takes on that where that's, you know, that's actually the only way that ancient world created tall towers was by enslaving and oppressing the other for the sake of their name. So I'm there with that. But then the result of that is what we view as like a punishment. So God
Yeah.
confuses language and forces people to spread out. And that's where I'll argue that it's maybe in part it's punishment, but it's blessing because
Mm.
it's God equipping humanity to do the thing God called them to do from the beginning, which was to fill the earth. And as you fill the
Mm.
earth, that's going to mean that languages develop in different ways, and that languages then create cultures. And my way into that with my students is I talk about how much I love Neapolitan style wood fired pizza, and
Yeah.
that exists because we have this, you know, creation with incredible diversity, and you have amazing food that, you know, I just say, like, if
Yeah.
you like good food, thank God for
Yeah.
diverse creation and diverse
That's
cultures and
that's awesome.
languages.
That's a standard part of our table prayers in my family. When we sit down, the first thing that one of us will pray is often, God, thank you for Mexico. Thank you for Mexican food. Lord, thank you for Indians and Indian food. We just the delight of and the recognition that, like, okay, we don't get to taste, oh, I'm going to get into deep trouble here. We don't get to taste ceviche without thanking God for Peruvians and or Chileans. I'm going to let them fight that out.
I know what you really mean there, so it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to me, where you get to the other through travel is that that's how it was all set up, almost
Yeah.
as if there's never one language or people group that has a monopoly on how to speak about God or how to speak to God. One human group does not fully sort of express the image of God. Rather, it's in the human diversity that was separated, but then meant to, I would argue, meant to come back together in that
Yep.
diversity. Together, that diversity is set up to teach us something fundamental about who God is, right? Which
That's
is
right.
why the
That's right.
Spirit shows up and does that,
Yes.
right? With the
Yes.
scattered people. And yeah, it's mostly, I think, probably in Acts 2, that's people from you know, these are Jews who have been scattered from the Jewish diaspora, but they're speaking different language, and they're part of a different culture, right? And then this is just, it's just the
Absolutely.
beginning of bringing that all together. And so
Yes.
the point is the separation and diversity, and then what happens as you come around back to encounter that, because it turns out we grow up ethnocentric, and
Hmm.
it takes the other to teach us something fundamental about who we are as humans, about what this world is like, and then from my faith standpoint, I would say about who God is.
That's right. That's right. What's true and what God is like. So this is what I mean by the ability to think thoughts that I wouldn't otherwise think, right? Through the experience of being bilingual, and you can't learn all of the languages or begin to embody all of the worldviews on the planet. So I'm I get a taste of it, right? Where I start thinking more like a Peruvian, experiencing more like a Peruvian, processing that way. And all of a sudden I realize, oh, there is legitimately a different way to experience and know, and that includes experience and know God,
Mm-hmm.
that is unavailable to me. And I can have that through communion, through deep relationship with this other, cultural other, who then is able to teach me things I can't otherwise know. and we would like to think that no, God's universal, and we think in these really abstract terms that are ultimately fueled by ethnocentrism, right? That I'm capable as a U.S. American of knowing all there is to know, knowing the truth, and it's this sort of abstract universal principle out there. I can know God fully, and it's like, listen, you can't. Hey, for those who are listening to the dogs bark,
I'm so
this is a
sorry.
part. No, this is what it means to have a conversation in a neighborhood in Arequipa. This is how this works, and so we are experiencing a different cultural reality at this moment,
I was looking
and
for
that's
the
good.
mute button. I was like, how do I mute, my
Yeah,
microphone here to just for the just the
yeah. No, no
gratuitous
problem, no problem
level.
at all. No, it's good. And so that truth, that basic truth, that through encountering genuine others, you are able, in that, because of that relationship and the conversation that arises from that relationship, you are able to receive the gift of an understanding, a perspective, an experience to some extent, because it's always bridging rather than living in that other reality. But to some extent, what you couldn't otherwise see, know, or experience. And I am with you. I think that's very much the point. I know I understood the caveat that you were making about the Babylon story is supposed to tell us this lesson about, this is a punishment, this is a bad thing, and they had to be punished, and the punishment is uh, scattering people with diverse languages. And so the implicit understanding of that, which I received growing up, was that it's bad that we have so many languages, because wouldn't it have been nice we could have all understood each other and we wouldn't have these conflicts, and things would be better if we all spoke the same language, and that language should be English. And and but the fact of the matter is, God in that story isn't simply punishing those people. God is insisting that the multiplication that he wanted in the first place happen, and
Hmm.
the cultural diversity emerge from that. And so what you don't have, which is what I was taught growing up, what you don't have at Pentecost is God reversing Babel.
Right, right,
It
right.
is not a reversal,
It's a
right? Because
fulfillment.
yeah, it's not that God goes, all right, now by the power of the Holy Spirit, you will all speak the same language and things will be as they should have been. Rather, he puts people in multiple relationships into a relationship of communion in Christ that now enriches the church's understanding of God and truth and beauty and goodness in ways that would be impossible without that diversity. And so that dawned on me. I remember actually where I was when that hit me at Harding. That specifically, that, oh no, this is not a reversal.
Hmm.
This is not that. It's something else that affirms the goodness of diversity of languages and cultures and experiences. So, boy, I'm picking up what you're putting down, man.
Well, and a big part of the New Testament that we got is the fallout or the result from this Jewish Christian thing really opening up and having to face the other and the conflict that that entails, and what does it look like when we start to do life together, right? Crossing these cultural barriers, and it all aims towards this space in Revelation 7, where you're in the throne room of God, and it's every nation, tribe, people, and language worshiping with these words: "Be to our God forever and ever." And it's and I very much picture that, as it says, every language group mentioned there. This is a great, chorus of multiple languages singing here. This is not just all monolingual worship to God. It's very much worship, and that's what it's all sort of headed to or pointing towards, right? And so yeah, I love sort of there's just a through line of the whole
Yeah,
story, from Genesis to Revelation, of all the families of the earth, all the nations, all the
yeah,
language groups, right? And Humans tend not to be so good at actually making that happen. And so it's God
Right.
who's really driving this, and connecting. After separating, God brings back together in special ways, or chooses one family like Sarah and Abraham's family to be, I'm going to bless you so that, through you and your family, I can bring blessing to all the families of the earth. Right. And so,
Yeah. So since we're not good at that, it requires intentional practices to engage across those differences. And as far as I understand what you're arguing in your theology of travel, travel is one of those fundamental practices, right? So there's what God is doing, but now I get to get on my soapbox and talk about how we meet God in what God is doing and can choose or choose not to participate in that, right? And participation is always a decision. It's a response and requires, I find very often, a set of thoughtful, intentional practices where we're dealing with our limitations as participants in the best ways that we can. And it seems to me, tell me if this is right, that you're looking at travel as this sort of complex set of practices that are very much about that you go about travel with this theological framework in order to participate intentionally in this coming together of difference. Is that more or less hit the mark?
yeah, yeah. So I talk about travel itself as sort of this threshold experience or a liminal space that's created, because when you move from one place to the other, or perhaps have this whole idea of theology on the way, where there's
There
this
we go.
journey, where there's movement, right? And it's in that travel, that movement, that liminal space, threshold experiences that. Spaces open up for these sort of intentional practices that teach us something fundamentally about what I call the diversity of God. All right. So,
Mm-hmm.
like this sort of diversity baked into who God is. And if you have a Trinitarian perspective, you're already saying that, right? Three
That's
and one.
right.
And so I think about travel as the threshold experience, and then within, and obviously like travel is a practice on its own, but I think of that more as the threshold experience that then provides all of this space for practices that
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that are teaching us something, or through which the Spirit is forming us. And I've talked about when I did a dissertation recently for a doctorate of ministry that I was able to do, and talked about intercultural spiritual formation. So that
Yeah.
there's spiritual formation, there's the Spirit's forming work in our lives, and it has this intercultural result or impact,
Mm.
because we are our view of who God is grows, and then that
Mm-hmm.
necessarily implies that our view of humanity, and the diversity of humanity, that grows as well, so that our love of God grows and our love of our diverse neighbor grows. And then there's so many implications for then like love for and care for a diverse earth as well, right? So
Yeah.
there's different implications, but yeah, there's specific practices that can that we do, and that like for my students are just like a required part of the curriculum,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
That with some reflection, some theological reflection, I believe can be part of the Spirit's forming work to make us better people, and like
Mm-hmm.
more whole, more complete people, which means more able to recognize the image of God in the diverse other. And that has implications. If you just want to stay in the US, how would things change if we were able to recognize the image of God in the one who is different than I am, politically or
Yeah.
religiously, or socioeconomically, ethnically, racially, right? I mean, so there's all sorts of implications for this, where what I mean by becoming better people is just sort of the people that God intended us to be, right? Which was
Mm-hmm.
able to sort of reflect God, right? The image of God into diverse spaces and sort of honor that experience of God with diverse peoples and the interaction, within that.
That's cool. You mentioned spiritual formation, which made me think of a book that I'm using in my Christianity in Culture class. I was curious if you've come across it. It's called Our Unforming, De-Westernizing Spiritual Formation.
Okay, so with the subtitle, maybe I have. I haven't interacted with it, but I've
Yeah,
heard
yeah.
definitely heard that subtitle.
Yeah, so just to let listeners know, that's a book that I'm using in this class, and you can hear Our Unforming, De-Westernizing Spiritual Formation. There's a bit of a polemic in there.
Hmm.
It's written by Cindy Lee, who is bringing her bicultural reality as an Asian American into conversation about spiritual formation, and I think just really helpfully, you know, opens students' eyes, opens readers' eyes to the fact that even spiritual formation, even the practices of spiritual formation, are not monocultural, abstract, and universal. Right? That we can learn from others culturally beyond what when you talk about Western culture, you're actually talking about a massive block that is itself very culturally diverse,
Hmm.
but you're zooming out to a level where you're recognizing, you might say, sociologically shared cultural features, and even that block is very distinctive in its practice of Christianity, and tends to be what people default to thinking of Christianity as a Western religion, even though it began as an Eastern religion and still has many other global manifestations, and recognizing therefore that I can learn how to interact with the Spirit, how to experience God in terms of specific practices of spiritual formation that um, I wouldn't necessarily perceive or think of in the same way as a Westerner, as a U.S. American, and it just speaks to the same reality that if you think, I know the list of spiritual disciplines, right? I've read Richard Foster, I've read Dallas Willard, whatever. Though I know the list of spiritual disciplines, and it's standard and universal across time. And you go like, well, actually, there are many other practices of spiritual formation that our culturally other friends might teach us, and so that's an interesting thing to ponder.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And there's a sort of a question baked into that, and something that I really lean on in the introduction of my theology of travel, and that I sort of set up for my students when they're here, because that's really the impetus for all of this, and really thinking deeply about it is because I get to
Mm-hmm.
lead students through this process. And at the same time, I've been thinking about how also to lead some of my Peruvian friends as they also have this special encounter with US Americans because of this group, but then also because of crises, decades and more of crisis in Venezuela. There have been a lot of Venezuelans who are in Peru and have been living here for years, and there's a reaction that my Peruvian neighbors have towards receiving people from the U.S., and that's different towards how they're receiving people in Venezuela. So I'm conscious as well about how I can invite to this sort of formative table, right? Because of the Spirit's forming work on these different levels. But Jonathan Sacks, the late rabbi who
Mm-hmm.
was in the UK, in this book called The Dignity of Difference,
Mm-hmm.
asked these three questions. And with your, especially, there's one in particular that, with what you were just talking about, I think really connects. And the first is, can we make space for difference? All right.
Mm-hmm.
Then,
Mm-hmm.
can we hear the voice of God in a language, a sensibility, a culture not our own? And that's the one where, like, can we hear from God through these other formative practices that are not our
Yeah.
own? And there's language there, and there's sensibility, and there's this sort of attunement that is happening through this diversity. And then his final question is, can we see the presence of God in the face of a stranger? I think too often we're just not, because we view the image of God as clearly how I image God as a, white male with U.S. American parents, born in
Hmm.
Italy, and we're not expecting to see the presence of God in the stranger. But in fact, that just may very well be the place where we come into the deepest experience of who God is through the one who is different than I am. And that was my
Absolutely.
experience in Zambia. It was because the image of God in the Zambian experience was so different than mine that it just,
Hmm.
alerted me in a whole new way.
Right.
Turns out though, you don't have to travel to do this. Like
No,
you might have to
no.
cross the street or go to a different neighborhood, but
Yeah.
actually the ends of the earth, to use that Acts language, the ends of the earth are all around us, right? I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's and so you don't actually have to step on a plane.
That's right.
Although the travel does create the space, and I feel like really good opportunities for seeing it. You don't have to go far for this sort of
That's
form of
right.
work.
Well, so let me make two separate points riffing on what you just said. The first is that you mentioned early on that the two of us were sent in the traditional model of mission work, right?
Hmm.
Being sent to a foreign place. And I've talked before, and so I won't belabor the point here, but there's a massive shift that's happened where now we're recognized, there it is, Western Christian, let me say, how do you, what's the way to say that? Historically Christianized Western contexts have now come to recognize that our own home places are themselves also, no more and no less, the field of God's mission, and that God is up to things in those places that we can participate in. And that is particularly obvious simply in the fact that so much of the world has come to places like the United States, and the cultural diversity. And I recognize that I'm saying this in the midst of a really fraught political climate in regard to immigration.
Yeah.
So there's a subtext there, and we can talk about that if you want to go down that road. But I'm simply saying that the reality of our once Western cultural spaces is now radical diversity in many places on that bell curve that I talked about earlier. There are many places that are still culturally isolated, but even those are either through new media and the internet, or simply by virtue of going to the city for date night or whatever, in relationship with very culturally different people. So that's happened. And just to affirm the point that you're making, you may be able to cross the street or you may be able to drive a couple towns over or whatever, but it's right there if you want to engage, which raises the question of why you would. To what end, right? Because so many of us are just going about our lives and sort of doing our thing and having incidental encounters with people who are quite different from us in one way or another, and that just sort of happens and passes us by. And so what we're talking about is paying attention
Yeah.
in a particular way to what God is doing. Now, you were talking about the image of God in people, and that is the starting place, absolutely, theologically, and you might say even sequentially, just paying attention to the image of God in people who are very different. I always want to advocate for, I don't know how many steps further, but paying attention to what God is doing actively in the
Hmm.
lives of our neighbors, and in this conversation, especially our neighbors who are quite different than us in one way or another. And so just the last point that I wanted to add is a lot of us travel. A lot of U.S. Americans, because we're wealthy enough and have the freedom of movement necessary, we travel mostly for vacation, mostly for
Hmm.
diversion, right? And that's happening in our U.S. American churches so much, so often, in ways that are actually very similar to that day-to-day life that I was just talking about, where you're going to go to have fun. You're going to go to have an experience of newness, right? So there's an extent to which we like new things, right? Neophilia is pretty rampant. We like to have new experiences and go fun places and be distracted. But we pass through those encounters with real difference basically inattentive, because that's not what we're there for. We're there for our own entertainment. And neophilia is quite a bit different than xenophilia, than genuine love for otherness
Yeah.
and the other, right? And so what I really like about what you're saying is, I feel like for perhaps some listeners and many potential listeners out there to this conversation, is this challenge that, like, yeah, you travel, but do you travel in this way? Do you travel in order to truly engage with the otherness that represents God to you in ways that would be otherwise inaccessible to you? I don't want to ruin everybody's vacation. That's not my point. We go on our excursions as well, and look for moments of respite and renewal. That's not bad. I'm not saying anything about that. I'm saying we travel a lot, and a vast majority of that travel, in my experience of North American church, of U.S. American church people, is, it's not to pay attention. It's not to be really attentive to that otherness.
Yeah. However, what I will say is this, and this is where Barbara Brown Taylor has helped me to think about this, is that it is, I think, maybe I was going to say normal or more typical. I think it maybe just more commonly happens that when people of faith travel to really amazingly beautiful places, so say in my context, the Amazon or Patagonia, or, you're traveling, to some mountain range, or just to the ocean or whatever it is. What does a person of faith typically say when they look out on the majesty of creation? They say, wow, God is amazing, right? So there
Yeah,
is this sense of like being able to see God in creation and
wonder.
expecting it,
Yeah,
and that feeding the awe, the wonder that feeds into our faith. And Barbara Brown Taylor, in her book "An Altar in the World," will say, okay, so we're good at doing that when we look at creation. What about looking at our neighbor,
mm.
right? Or what about
Yeah,
and so we do that as we travel, sometimes with nature, right? That there's at least this opportunity where that's happening. And so
hmm,
I think the idea or the push, or what makes me hopeful, is that what if we could just be just as much in awe about human diversity, right?
mm.
Even when it plays out in really difficult or annoying ways. Sometimes the
Yeah,
experience of travel in a place where you don't, understand the language, or where it's difficult or complicated, can be deep frustration. Uh,
absolutely.
right. And so but what if we actually expect to see something of God there? And what
Hmm.
Barbara Brown Taylor will say is actually that's the point, so that we look at the person bagging our groceries, and see God in that interaction, right? Or
Hmm.
the person when we do cross the street, or when we have an encounter. And some people, especially like from my perspective, where I'm open to difference, and I'm looking for God within that. And then sometimes the hardest, the biggest challenge for me, and I just want to call this out in myself, is when it's somebody that's way closer to home, but that views the whole thing, say politically in the United States, differently to me. It's a lot harder for me to recognize or see the image of God in that diversity when
Yeah,
but no, but you're missing the point, right? And so
yeah, yeah.
anyway, sometimes I can be way more open to seeing that in somebody culturally and linguistically, racially, way different than me, and then actually the person that looks a lot like me but is not seeing this, I don't give them the same grace that perhaps you know the image of God in each of us
Yeah,
deserves.
yeah. Which I want to identify. Again, we're sort of in missiology 101 to some extent here. one of the basic questions that we start grappling with as we think about cross-cultural ministry, etc., is how do you sort out, when you're talking about culture, the good from the bad, right? Because we're actually when we encounter otherness, we're really good at identifying the things we think are bad, that are
Hmm.
inferior, that are, in Christianese, that these are the product of sinful nature and misperceptions of truth and all that sort of thing. And so there's this, in sort of introductory missiology, we begin to struggle with this baby bathwater thing of like, what are you going to affirm? What are you going to critique? How do you actually separate those things? Because they're all woven together in a solid cultural fabric. And it's easy for us, even in our local contexts, when we encounter difference and otherness, to almost default as a knee-jerk reaction to, well, it's different because it's bad, because it's
Hmm.
wrong, right? Because the way I do things is right and good, and even even when we sort of get on a meta level and we are dealing with people who are different from us in regard to our perspective on difference, that we see, oh, that's ethnocentrism, that's narrow-mindedness, that's, yeah, and that's a way that you're different from me, and that's how I know that I'm right and you're wrong, right? And just there's a real struggle that I just want to acknowledge, rather than
Yeah.
offering, the solutions, because it really is very different in different situations. Just acknowledge the difficulty of sorting that out and going, well, part of the reason that I really have a hard time being in a room with you is because I don't know how to disentangle the the beauty of your perspective from the places where I'm perceiving sin.
Hmm.
And it's always that's so when that happens on that level, I just want to say that's a reflection of what's happening on a much bigger level when you're having these amazing cultural experiences. When it comes down to, all right, but what does the church look like here, and
Hmm.
what are we going to do, and what are we going to say we shouldn't do, and believe and think, and all of that? It's awfully tough sometimes, sorting that out.
Yeah, part of the gift of good, responsible travel, right? And travel that is life affirming, dignity affirming, okay? But part of the gift of that is being able to confront some of your own assumptions, right? And so when you're able to do it and get past sort of that ethnocentric barrier, you're able to see like, wow, I assumed all of these things that I just thought were universal, and they're not. They're actually very, and so, and what's funny is, especially we're in a city now, and some of the things that I thought were maybe very U.S. American are actually just sort of rural versus urban,
Yep.
right? And there's this whole dynamic there that's
Yep.
culturally nuanced, right? And so that, I think one of the gifts of travel is holding a mirror up to yourself. And if we can acknowledge that we all are on the way, or we all are works in
Mm.
progress, that maybe in those moments of travel we just might learn something about ourselves that could that ought to be questioned, or that we just have space to learn and grow in new ways.
Wow, I don't think we could end on a better note than that. If we can all
Are we ending? I
acknowledge
thought we were just getting started.
we're on the way. Well, we are just getting started, but we'll pause for now and come back to the conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know how busy you are, and you're getting ready for a whole batch of students to come in and have ministry and all the rest of it going on. So it is a privilege, and I'm really grateful.
Yeah, Greg, so thankful for the chance to get to speak with you. So blessings on your semester too, and families move, and all of that coming up. Really thankful for your friendship.
Likewise, my friend, and peace upon your household. Y'all
All
take
right,
care.
pass.
Ciao.